Lady of the Mist by S.L. Thorne. Dedication. For Jack, Trey and Laura, and Chris. You know what you did. And for my daughter who put up with do not disturb signs and stop reading over my shoulder. And for Stanley, who never lived to see this, but nonetheless never doubted I'd do it. Chapter 1. The woman they called the Lady of the Mist leaned on the parapet rail, drinking in the early morning air. She smiled softly as she watched the Fey sun rise, wildly coloring the sky and beginning to burn off the morning fog. The two guards on the wall with her stood at opposite ends of the walk between two small towers and politely ignored her, keeping their watch in silence. She was not what anyone would call beautiful. She had an unremarkable Irish face. Her complexion alone was enviable, fair but with a light gilding from the sun. Her eyes were a faded silvery green, nothing at all striking about them. Her hair flowed down her back in waves of mousy brown and stopped just short at the bottom of her ribs, teased just now by the fresh dawn wind. Compared to the willowy elven women she dealt with daily, she was short and thick, though in truth she was neither. Back home she was considered tall for a girl, but not rangy. Her attire was like everything else about her, modest, only hinting at the figure beneath the front-laced bodice. Her clothes were good elven plain cloth cut in old Celtic style. A full-length peasant skirt that just brushed the lower laces of her short boots and a rich evergreen that matched the bodice. Her white blouse was the finest thing on her, cobweb linen embroidered at its high throat and wrists with some fave flowering vine hiding tiny owls and dragonflies picked out in white threads. The little princess had embroidered it for her with her own hands, and it was precious to her. The sky slowly eased out of its gaudy splendor, and the sun began to dimple the forest floor through gem-like dewdrops. She cast her eye past the great oak and over the jeweled forest, and decided that today was an excellent one for woodlore. Reaching up, she gathered her hair and wound it into a bun at the nape of her neck, securing it with a twisted pin she pulled from a pocket. Satisfied, she turned and left the wall for the tower door, her boot heels clicking softly in her wake. The two guards watched her go without turning. The senior of them smiled, taking a deep breath. The newer of the two actually turned his head to catch the last swirl of dark green skirt and black boot heel as the door closed behind her. Bit of a starling, that one. He did not mean it as a compliment. I think that's the least severe I've ever seen the governess. The older man's smile only half faded. Aye, the only time you'll catch her with her hair down in any sense. But I'd not write her off just because she can't hold a candle to fey women. Oh, she's country pretty, I guess, he interjected. The other man brushed off his compatriot's rudeness. Never be fooled by a pretty face, lad. Nor a plain one, either. Deep as a well, that one. Sure, you can fall in and maybe drown, he shrugged. Then his eye took on a hungry glint. But you'll never die of thirst if you can. Apparently the younger man did not ken, and shrugged, turning back to watching the sky and the wood before him. She was every inch a governess as she entered the children's rooms. The suite began with a large, comfortable room that served as playroom, sitting room, and schoolroom all in one. From that chamber radiated three smaller ones belonging respectively to the Lion Prince, the eldest and 11 by all appearances, the Eagle Princess, an introspective 8, and finally, the youngest prince, a small, thoughtful boy of 5. At her entrance, the 3 attendants straightening the room snapped to attention and ran to their respective charges' apartments to wake and dress them for the day. She moved to arrange things on her desk and gather the materials she would need in the woods for a lesson decent enough to justify the picnic she had requested in the kitchens. As a mortal girl serving governess to fey children, she often had her hands full. Human children can be playful and unconsciously cruel at times, but fey children can be puckish, pulling pranks that are dangerous to any but themselves and 20 times more difficult to control. They had magics at their command she could not begin to fathom or rein in, but while she could not teach them how to use them, she taught them how to apply them responsibly. Over the first few decades, she had developed methods of disciplining them with disapproval, as she could not very well lay a hand on them. They were more than just fey. They were royal fey, gentry, and rare as water in the desert. And she loved them. Though she had been just 16 when she had accepted the position a century and a half ago, she looked barely over 20. The children had not aged a day in all that time in either appearance or manner. They learned, though, like all children. They soaked up all she could teach them like the sponges that children are, and asked for more. She had exhausted her own skills and knowledge after the first decade, and had been forced to continually educate herself to keep apace. The keeper of the library had given her a marvelous bracelet to celebrate her first quarter century, when it became obvious she was going to stay for the long haul. It allowed her to absorb all the information she could on any given subject, until she no longer needed it to teach them, and let it slip away again to make room for other things. It seemed that human minds can only hold so much, while fey ones are infinite wells so long as they are young. She found that the adult gentry seemed to lack the ability to take in new information if it was too complex. That or remembering too much was hard. Oh, they could remember everything that happened to them personally, and sometimes gossip of people they knew, especially where it affected themselves. But remembering words of a new language that did not fascinate them, or, say, the pertinent facts of the process of experimentation, these things slipped from their minds like sand through an hourglass. It was not long at all before the children began to filter in from their rooms. The youngest was first, trotting in with his fingers in his mouth and an arm around a huge, armored teddy bear. He grinned broadly at the sight of her and ran over, pulling his fingers out of his mouth long enough to cry, "Nan!" and throw his arms around her skirts. She bent to return the hug and laughed when Teddy winked at her and shrugged an apology when he was crushed against her as well. She gave his ear a tweak to straighten it and caressed him fondly before standing at the princess's entrance. The princess was far more formal than her brother. She curtsied when she saw that the governess had noticed her and chirruped a polite, "Morning, miss." She noticed that, although she had not told the servants of her plans for the day, they had nonetheless prepared them appropriately. The princess was in heavier cloth than her usual embroidered silks, much the stuff her elders wore hunting, though still finer of cloth and cut than that of kings in the world of men. It was cut suitably for a day in the wood. A shorter skirt that was not over full and stopped mid-shin, a pair of ruffled pantaloons beneath for modesty, and soft leather boots with no heels. Even her heel-length fall of golden hair had been drawn back from her face. The intricate braids had been gathered and pinned up with flowers and one or two live butterflies so that they seemed to form a crown above her very sharply perceiving, steely eyes. It brought the length of it up to the middle of her back, which was practical. Not far behind her was the eldest. His features were strikingly handsome, and his hair fell about his face and shoulder like a rippling mane of red gold, no matter what was attempted to tame it. His eyes were a jeweled blue, and his mischievous smile could charm frightened birds to his hands and maidens into swoons. He was outright dressed for hunting. He smiled at her as he reached out to slide a stray braid from his sister's shoulder. "Teacher," he purred. Names were things of power here, and long ago she had accepted the loss of her own. She was merely what she was, even as the children were what they were. They were called by their titles, even as the king was called by his. They watched her, waiting. They seemed to suspect something out of the ordinary was in the offing. She smiled, taking down a large book on wood lore. "I thought that today would be a good one for a picnic." She braced herself just in time as the youngest threw himself at her legs again, then began dancing with his Teddy. She smiled indulgently. "Teddy can't come, darling." The boy stopped, frowning. "Teddy will get dirty, for one, and he has been up all night watching you. He needs his rest." The prince looked at his bear, only a little shorter than he. Teddy nodded solemnly and made a big deal of yawning. The prince sighed and hugged him. "Night-night. Sleep tight," he said. Teddy saluted the governess and marched back to the bedroom. The moment the door closed on him, the prince regained his excitement about the trip. "Where are we going?" She smiled. "A mile or so out. There's a nice glen near the river we haven't explored, and there are plenty of berries and other things I need to teach you about." The young prince frowned. "I thought it was a picnic, not a lesson." The governess laughed. "No reason it can't be both. And if you ever go hunting and lose your party, then what I will teach you will help you survive until you find help or your way home. Besides, you should know every inch of your kingdom." She held the book out to the eldest. "Would you carry that for me, your highness?" He bowed and accepted the book, flashing her his winning smile. The governess turned for the door. "Now, if we are ready, we just have to stop in at the kitchens for the basket, and we can go."